turn to Daniel chapter 11, and we're getting close to the end of the book, but or it looks like we are, but we're not as close as you think. We're going to spend a couple of lessons on this chapter 11, at least two. We're not going to get through the whole chapter tonight because there's a lot to cover here. And I brought my study Bible tonight because there's some of the references in here that I want to look at. In chapter 11, let's go ahead and start with verse 1, and we'll read verses 1 and 2 to begin with. Also, I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. Now that's kind of odd for a man of God, isn't it, to stand and confirm and to strengthen the king of the land that you're in captivity in. But remember, Daniel was favored among the kings, and he treated the kings in a good way most of the time. You know, he wasn't rebellious, other than as long as they left him alone to worship as he wanted to worship. He didn't rebel against the law of the land. He was good and faithful to whoever was king, whether it was the Babylonian kings Nebuchadnezzar and his son, or it was Darius or Cyrus or whoever it was. He was a good, faithful servant to the king, as we're commanded to be when the king's in the right. Now, he strengthened him. What does he mean by that? Well, he encouraged him to do what was right. And you look and you see it in verse 2, and now will I show thee the truth. This is Daniel speaking to the king. There's another prophecy coming here. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all, and by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. Now, last time, if you remember, we talked a little bit about the Greek Empire, and throughout Daniel, it comes up, because that's the next empire that comes into play on the world scene after the Medes and the Persians. In this case, he says, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia. Now, Darius, if you remember, was the first one. He took over when, let's turn back to chapter 5, Daniel chapter 5, and the last verse there. And if you remember, Belshazzar, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, was king just for a short time. Wasn't very long, just a few years. And it says in we'll start with verse 30. In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So Belshazzar was slain. The Babylonian Empire is no more. The Medes and the Persians, remember, had joined forces. They had conquered a lot of the world that the Chaldeans had under the Babylonian rule. And then once they conquered Babylon and slew Belshazzar, then they were in complete control. Darius, it says he was a Median. He was a Mede. And I forget now, but his mother or father, one was a Median, the other one was a Persian. And so he took over the kingdom of what had been the kingdom of Babylon, or the kingdom of the Chaldeans, and oversaw that part of the world. He was also king of the Persians. And then you go on into, and we're not going to go into chapter 6, but we see a little bit about Darius in chapter 6. Also, chapter 9, we see Darius again. Now, some try to tell us that there was 2 men named Darius that were kings. I don't know, I'm gonna be honest. It's a little confusing to me on the ones that I read after that tell you that, where they get their information from, because if you look at the scripture, it doesn't seem to be that way. It looks as though it's the same man. And so that's what I'm gonna go with, but, like I said, I'm not dead set on that because I don't know. Maybe there's some historical factors that I'm not seeing, but it just doesn't make sense how they get, where they get that from. But we know Darius was the first. Now, the next king was Cyrus. Cyrus, we see in chapter 10, he was king of Persia. He was king of all of Media and Persia. Cyrus, if you remember from last time, Daniel had this vision of the heavenly messenger that came, which was, we concluded was the Lord himself, came and brought this prophecy to Daniel. And Cyrus, if I'm understanding correctly, was the nephew of Darius. Darius was his uncle. I don't quote me on this, but I think Cyrus even married one of Darius's daughters, if I understood right. And anyway, so those are the first two kings of the 3 or 4 that he mentions here. There was some other kings that weren't as popular after Cyrus. One was I don't remember, he was like a distant cousin or a distant nephew or something in the family, and really he was referred to as the one who really didn't belong as king, but for whatever reason he did, and I really couldn't find much information on him and why, but there was some weaker kings, in other words. Darius and Cyrus were fairly strong and fairly popular kings, not just because they're in the book of Daniel, but because it's what they were. There was another one after them, which would make the third king, that was as popular as they were. But this fourth king, he says, shall be richer, far richer than they all. Who is this? Well, you ever heard of Xerxes? Am I saying his name right? He was another popular one. Now, we don't see his name mentioned here, but he was another of the Persian kings. And if you go back to Esther, turn back to the book of Esther, and there's even, and I don't understand why. After I read up on it, it's very simple. The book of Esther, and I'm going to read a little bit from the notes in my study Bible here, just the historical notes. Xerxes was the Greek name of the man, and that's where the confusion is. You have some people who don't want to bother doing some study to see who he really was, but if you look in Esther, chapter 1, in verse 1, it says, now it came to pass in the days of Assyrius, and this is the Assyrius which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. If you go back to Daniel, chapter, let's see. I thought it was chapter 9, but it's chapter 6. It says it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes. These were over 120 of the provinces there, those princes were. And then Xerxes, if you see, or Assyrius, was over 120 provinces. So the provinces had grown by the time he comes to power. Now, this name Assyrius is the Hebrew form of his name. Xerxes was the Greek form of his name. That's why that's the difference. It doesn't take much. You can do just a little bit of study and find that. Now, why some disagree on that, I have no idea. But just like the name Esther is not a Hebrew name, it's a Persian name. Hadassah was her Hebrew name. So those things happen. Then Xerxes, it says here that he was a boisterous man of emotional extremes, whose actions were often strange and contradictory. And you see that in the book of Esther. He went back and forth between things, and he would make a decree and then go back and change it again sometime later. And that's what they bring out here. He made a decree to annihilate all the Jews, and he goes back and changes it. Now we know the Lord had a hand in that, but that's the type of man he was. He wasn't reliable. In other words, he wasn't mentally stable. It was what we call it today. So we'll see. We may come back to Esther here in a few moments, but back in Daniel 11, if we read on, and if you notice, it says, by his strength through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. Xerxes had an army and went up against the Grecian army. Now this was about the time Alexander the Great was coming on the scene. He had conquered Greek in Mesopotamia, in those areas. Not Mesopotamia, Greece and Macedonia is what I was trying to think of, that part of the world. And then he began to branch out and began to go into the Middle East and begin to fight against some of the Persians and the Chaldeans and the Medes and the Persians over there. If you just pay attention to things that, even there's popular movies that have come about. There's a lot of the Greek mythology that's talked about. A lot of those things took place during this time that we're going to look at tonight. A lot of those things, the battles and the wars that were fought that you read about in that time period, took place and are talked about here in Daniel in chapter 11. It's amazing. When you start reading through this chapter and you study and see where or what was taking place here, or what would be taking place, I should say, because this is prophecy in Daniel's time. Remember, Darius is still the king. This hasn't got to Xerxes yet. He's talking about Xerxes in the future. He doesn't name him, but we see where he's going to come to power, and it says he's far richer than they all. He was richer, and he says, and by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up against the realm of Grecia. So he was richer and more powerful than the three kings before him. Verse 3, and a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. Now, this is not Xerxes. This is Alexander the Great. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion, which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those. Now, if you remember in history, Alexander the Great died a young man. He was in his 30s. In the prime of his life is what we would refer to it as. He was even in the prime of his ruling. He was king of the world, or the known world in that day. He had conquered, they say, from Greece and possibly even parts of Italy, all the way to India, and then as far south as Egypt and Ethiopia. When he died, 4 of his generals took power of the kingdom, and they split it up into 4 different kingdoms. And we're going to talk about 2 of those tonight. And I'm not going to try to pronounce their names. They're Greek names, and I'm not going there. I'm not wasting our time trying to pronounce names like that. Yeah. You want to do it? No. That's what I thought. Anyway, just know that there were 4 kings, or four generals who became kings in their own right. They had no right to the kingdom, but they took power of the kingdom. And that's, and we've looked at that briefly before in Daniel. Now, when he shall stand up, in other words, when he is in his prime, he's conquered the world. There's cities all over that part of the world named Alexandria in honor of Alexander. Probably, I would say there's some that were called Alexander that are not there anymore, or the Muslims have changed their names, whichever. But he was known all over the world, and he was favored by his people, by the ones he conquered. Even they looked to him in a high regard. And for the most part, other than when they rebelled and he fought against them, other than then, he was a decent guy as far as that was concerned, as far as kings go. But he died young. These 4 generals took over. It says, it shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven. They divided the kingdom into 4. Now, 2 of them, we'll see, they were stronger than the other 2, and eventually overtook the other 2. But we'll get to that in a moment. And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. This king of the south ruled from Egypt. You ever heard of Alexandria, Egypt? In their day, that was the capital of Egypt. That was the Greek capital of Egypt. That's where it was a major port on the Mediterranean Sea, and they ruled from there. And you can go and read up on the things what we refer to as antiquities. That's that time period. And you go back and you read some of that, and there's all kinds of evidences that they were there, so we know it's true. But this king ruled in the south. He ruled from Egypt, from Syria southward is where he ruled, and as far west as India. And we'll see the northern kingdom here in a moment. The northern kingdom was from Syria north and covered what was Iran, Iraq, that part of the world, and all the way back over to Greece. Now, he says, the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes. When the king of the south, when eventually he dies, and his son, one of his princes, it says, his son would take over. Now, in verse 6, in the end of years they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and be that strengthened her in these times. It's a little confusing language here, but basically the daughter of the king of the south goes to the king of the north and makes an agreement to marry. And it's deception. It's a trick. The marriage does happen, but it's not. It's trying. The king of the north thinks that they're trying to bring the 2 kingdoms together, and that's not what it's about. It's to overthrow the north. Is what the goal is. Verse 7. But out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate. Now the branch of her roots, that's her children. So she does marry, remember, and has children with the king of the north, which shall, I say the king of the north, it's one of his sons, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. The army of the south is going to come and take over, and or at least try to take over the kingdom of the north. And what actually happens, if you read through history, you see where they do overthrow Syria, which was part of the kingdom of the north, and which was where the king of the north ruled from. He's pushed back at this time. Verse 8, and shall also carry captives into Egypt, their gods, with their princes, and with their precious vessels of silver and of gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. So the king of the south, raids the king of the north, and what does he do? He takes it's kind of comical, because he steals all the false gods. Why? Because they're made of precious stones, precious metals, gold, silver, bronze. All he does is just he adds to his wealth, is what he's done. Plus the fact that, if you think about things in their day, he just humiliated that part of those people there because he stole their false gods, which is kind of a slap in the face to them, because now he's stolen their false gods. They don't have anything to worship. And if you know anything about and have been paying attention in our studies on these nations that were steeped in false religion, they thought a whole lot of their false gods. It's obvious, you see when we talk about Israel and the God of Israel and how he protected Israel, those other kingdoms didn't have that. When they came up against Israel, God protected Israel. When Israel came up against them, their gods didn't protect them. The God of Israel was much more mightier, and the nations around Israel knew this. They knew that the God of Israel was much more mightier than their false gods, and yet they still followed their false gods. And so here, the king of the south goes to the kingdom of the north, robs all their, or takes as spoils of war, takes their false gods, takes their princes, and he says, with their precious vessels of silver and of gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. The king of the north dies before the king of the south does. That's simple, pretty simple there. Verse 9, so the king of the south shall come into his kingdom and shall return into his own land. In other words, he returns back home. After the battle, he goes back home, back to Egypt. But his sons shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. His sons, the princes of the south, are stirring up more trouble. These Grecians were nothing but trouble. I can tell you that after Alexander was gone, these guys, they were fighting all the time, and for no reason a lot of times. And that's what we see here. There's really no reason for them to fight. The king of the north would have been just as happy if they'd have left him alone. He wouldn't bothering them, but they went up there and took care of business with him, and then now they're stirred up again. And we see here, why are they stirred up? There's no reason at all. I mean, I'm sure there was, if you were to look at it in secular history, I'm sure you could probably find something. But basically, there was no reason for them to get stirred up. They could have stayed home, had a peaceful life, lived off the spoils of the war, and everything would have been fine for them anyway. But, so the king of the south shall come into his kingdom and shall return into his own land. He goes back home. Let's see, verse 11, the king of the south shall be moved with choler, which is another word for anger, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. And he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. The king of the south is angered at the king of the north. But they're both going to come with great multitudes. And if you read up on this story in history, there was tens of thousands of soldiers in this battle. Every time they came together, and you see that if you studied the things on Greece and Rome in school, you see where they had large armies and these armies oftentimes were not from Greece; they were from the nations that they had conquered. That's like the Romans. They would oftentimes the nations that they conquered, they would pull the best of the best troops from those nations and put them into their own army. And that's who would fight the battles, because Greece wasn't that big of a place. Rome wasn't that big of a place. They had a lot of population, but not when you look at the armies that they produced. There's no way they could have produced them without the help of the nations they had conquered. So that's what's happening here. Great multitudes, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. The king of the south is going to win again. And when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up. In other words, he's going to brag about it. And he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. He's going to win the battle. He's going to kill tens of thousands, but it's not going to be a glorious fight, because he's going to lose a bunch of people too, a bunch of soldiers too. Even though he wins the battle, it's going to be a rough and a hard-fought battle. And when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up. Well, we already read that. Verse 13. For the king of the north shall return, and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with much riches. And if you remember a few verses back, where it said, verse 8, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. The king, by the time we get to verse 13, the king of the north has died. The original king, who was the general under Alexander. It's his son now who is king, and this new king of the north is going to return, and he's going to try to get revenge. He shall set forth a multitude greater than the former. There's going to be even a larger army. Now we see here it takes him a few years to do it. He says after a certain years, or shall certainly come after a certain years with a great army and with much riches. So he's amassed a much larger army than he had before, thinking that with bigger numbers, he can conquer the south. Verse 14, and in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. Now, he says, also the robbers of thy people. Who is thy people? He's talking, this is God talking to Daniel, remember? So the thy that he's talking about is Daniel. The people is Israel. The robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision. Who are the robbers of the people of Israel? The false prophets, the ones who were following after false gods but claimed to be of Israel. Remember those people? They're, even after the captivity is over with, and by the time the Grecian Empire comes along, those people are back again. Remember, there's a when you go through the book of Nehemiah, you see where the people repented. They were back in the land. Things were going good spiritually for them, but it wasn't long before the false gods and the false worship come back, and so that's who the robbers of thy people are. They're the ones who brought all that back to Israel. He says, they shall exalt themselves to establish the vision. In other words, to achieve the plan. What plan is that? To help the king of the north. If you see there, he says in the first part of that verse, and in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. The Jews still still had a hatred for their captivity at this time. And these, the king of the south had not been good to them, like some had been in the past. And so their thinking was, we'll help the north and the northern king and help him overtake the southern king. But he says, but they shall fall. In other words, they're going to fail. These robbers of the people of Israel, even though they think they're going to help achieve this plan of the king of the north, they're going to fail in it. Verse 15, so the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. They're going to take over part of the south. And he says, but he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do, and he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither before him. Now, who is this daughter of women? Study it out and see. I'll tell you, it's Cleopatra. Remember Cleopatra from the movies? It's not Elizabeth Taylor, but Cleopatra. This, if you study history, she was the daughter of the king of the south. If you remember, if you ever read the story of Cleopatra, it's been a really long time, so I couldn't tell you a lot about it other than the fact that she was very popular in her day. She was considered very beautiful in the land in that day. The king of the north is going to wind up marrying her, but he says, but she shall not stand on his side. She's not going to be for him. It's more of an alliance with the kingdoms to keep the king of the north from wiping everybody out, basically, the whole royal family. And it says neither be for him. She's never going to stand by him, never going to back him up even as her husband. And if you remember the story, Mark Antony plays a part in that, doesn't he? So she has an affair with a guy from Greece, or from Rome, actually. Mark Antony was from Rome. So we were very close here in this story to the transition from the Greek Empire to the Roman Empire. Verse 18, and this shall he turn his face unto the isles, and shall take many, but a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Without his own reproach, he shall cause it to turn upon him. Then he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. If I remember correctly, this is the king that supposedly, I guess his horse stumbled and he fell off and was killed. And he says was not to be found. I don't know how if he wasn't to be found, I don't know how they found that out. But anyway, that was the report that I read. Anyway, and so he's going to die, and that's going to be the end of his kingdom, basically. The Romans step in very soon afterwards. Then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes, in the glory of the kingdom. But within few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. A raiser of taxes. What were the Romans popular for? What are they known for? For raising taxes, were they not? You don't hear much about the Greeks raising taxes, do you? They did. I mean, all those kingdoms did demand a type of tax from the people, but the Romans were excessive with it. They were, well, you look at the time of Jesus' birth. They were going to Bethlehem to pay their taxes, not to the government of Israel, but to the Roman government. It was a decree from Caesar Augustus, remember? So the Romans were the ones who taxed the world. Verse 21, and in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. I'm going to stop there for tonight, because we're getting into some things that I want to look at a little bit deeper, but know that we're right on the edge of the Roman Empire coming to power here. And remember, this is Daniel. This is a prophecy that God's given to Daniel. It hasn't happened yet. It's not going to happen in Daniel's lifetime. It's going to be a few hundred years after Daniel dies, actually. And know, if you were to take a history book that told about these things and compare them to what we're seeing here, it fits perfectly. The prophecy that God gave to Daniel to write down for us fits perfectly well with what happened. Exactly with what happened. The way he describes, even though he doesn't name these kings, the way he describes them, the way he describes the events that happened, all these things actually happened. People who try to say that, well, the Bible's a book of stories, or a book of it's just a good history lesson, that's all it is. But for Daniel, this wasn't history. This was prophecy. This is worth things to come. Much of the Old Testament was history. You know, you look at the books that Moses wrote. Well, by the time the nation of Israel comes along, that's history, what Moses wrote. But what Daniel's writing is not history. It's prophecy in his day. And these things people don't know about yet. And when we get into chapter 12, we'll see where God tells Daniel to close up the book for a time. The people that are in the land of Israel after Daniel and up and all the way through what we're talking about tonight, those people don't understand it. They don't get it. They don't understand that who this is talking about. The book hasn't been opened up to them yet, and so they don't understand what he's talking about. They have no idea who the Grecians are. You know, the Greece at the time of Daniel was just a little bitty place, and nobody really cared about them. They weren't any power at all. But soon they're going to come and overtake the Medes and the Persians. They're going to take up at least all of their empire, and possibly a little more. And then when the Romans come, the Romans take up way more than any of them ever did. So we'll stop there for tonight. We'll, I don't know, we'll pick back up in maybe with verse 20 for next time. And then hopefully we'll finish the rest of the chapter. So anyway, we'll come back next time and see some more of the excitement.